Oh, welcome everyone to the Stoa. Today I'm super excited to have the one and only Ken Wilber, one of the greatest living philosophers, originator of integral theory, author of books like Brief History of Everything, The Religion of Tomorrow, and Grace and Grit. And Ken, I'm sure, is no stranger to those of us who stumbled their way to the Stoa. He has influenced many past guests and Stoa attendees. And yeah, he was a big influence on my thinking. I encountered his work, I think, when I was 17, 18, taking philosophy at university. And I was like super depressed at the postmodern worldview I was introduced to there. And it was really Ken's writing that gave me hope beyond postmodernism. So for that, I am forever grateful. And today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to have past guests at the Stoa ask Ken questions, which I'll tag in a moment. But of course, I have to ask one of my philosophical heroes a question myself. So Ken, how are you doing? You're on mute. You have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself, Ken. Let's see.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was saying thank you very much for having me on the program. I'm delighted to be here and looking forward very much to the discussion.
Beautiful. So let's jump right in it. You may know some of the people that will be asking you questions. And the first is the one and only Bonnitta Roy. Bonnitta, you're up.
Hey, Ken.
Hey.
We've never met. It's probably a great tragedy. And I'd like to start with sharing a little personal story in the Wayback Machine. So I met you through an article in Fast Company magazine, way back when Fast Company was a big, fat, cool magazine.
Right.
And that winter, I read your collected works. I think they first came out. And at the time, there was only these Yahoo listservs. And you were right at the same time, I don't know if you were writing them, but you were releasing the Cosmos trilogy, and this was all the rage. And it made us feel great, you know, to be behind the scenes, be behind you. And another thing I want to share is when your CD set came out with Sounds True. I mean, this is a while ago, right?
Right.
I remember buying it, and then on that listserv, I would mail it to the next person, and they would write their name, and they would mail it to the next person, and they would write their name and location, and then it would come back around, and you'd see all these people. And I always hoped that made it into your possession someday, but I did want to share that. So yeah. So yeah. So my questions though have to do with the future.
Okay.
So we get right. And I'm just going to read them so I don't get too straggly here.
Sure.
Okay, so actually from you, I heard that quote, like paradigms don't really transform themselves if people die, you know, like that quote. I'm wondering, what accepted scientific theory do you expect to be overturned that would make the biggest difference in how humanity views itself in the universe? It doesn't have to be an academic answer.
No, I have some thoughts on that. I think one of the biggest ones that, well, in a sense, there are two big ones, but they're related. One is looking at the fundamental forces in the universe that are considered an intrinsic part, an inherent part of the manifest universe. So typical ones that are already accepted include strong, weak, nuclear, electromagnetic, and gravitational. But what we're looking for is, are there any more forces that empirical science seems to demand that we postulate? And to give an example there, when we look at evolutionary theory, you might know, I'm sure you do, that in biological evolutionary theory right now, there's an enormous set of disagreements going on about why evolution occurs. There's no argument between the what of evolution. In other words, atoms came before molecules, came before cells, came before organisms, and then fish before amphibian, before reptiles, before mammals, before primates, and so on. So that's the what of evolution. And there's no or very little argument about that. Most intelligent modern biological evolutionists accept the what of evolution. It's the why of evolution that becomes so incredibly difficult to explain. And I would say now that at least half of evolutionary biologists believe that there has to be some force other than chance mutation and natural selection in order to explain the incredibly increasing drive we find towards self-transcendence, towards increasing complexity, increasing unities of those complexities that come about. So people from Stuart Kaufman at the Santa Fe Institute says what we need is a combination of natural selection and self-organization. And the self-organization is the added extra force that we need to see alongside of strong or weak nuclear, electromagnetic, and evolutionary, because it appears that there is an intrinsic drive in matter itself to build up into more complex forms. So you can take Ilya Prigoghine's Nobel Prize winning work on what he called order out of chaos. And he showed that even inanimate matter, in other words, dead material realms, right? That even they, when they're pushed far from equilibrium, escape the tension by jumping to higher levels of order. And I always use the simplistic example of you get splashy water going down the drain. And all of a sudden, out of that chaotic splashiness, it will sometimes jump into a perfectly ordered whirlpool. And then that will be how the water goes down the drain. Well, that's intrinsic, according to Prigogine, that's an intrinsic drive inherent even in dead matter. In other words, it becomes this order out of chaos is an actual drive in the universe that goes along with strong, weak nuclear, electromagnetic, and gravitational. Many different theorists have latched on to that notion. Eric Yontz, for example, called it self-organization through self-transcendence. And it is Ilya Prigoghine's order out of chaos. It was Francisco Varela's autopoietic self-organization. And that's the only thing that can tend to explain the extraordinary improbability of the degrees of diversity and complexity that evolution keeps producing. And standard probabilistic explanations just don't work. For example, the latest one I've seen is just to take one protein strand containing 150 amino acids. Now, for that to work, they have to be arranged in the correct order. And the chances of that correct order coming together in a correct sequence, the chances of that happening versus the chances of it not happening is 1/10 to the 77th power. that's considerably more number than there are of actual sum total organisms on the whole planet. And that's just dealing with one molecule. So we can't get these random mutations that happen every now and then. And then the ones that happen to produce changes in an organism that gives it, through natural selection, an advantage in sexual reproduction. That's just not enough to account for what we see. So even if you take somebody like Charles Peirce, who's generally regarded as America's greatest philosophical genius, he said that the number of forces to account for a real evolution that's continually producing these higher and higher states of increased complexity and increased organization. He said we have three forces that are generally used to try to describe evolution. One is a standard chance and necessity, and then those come together with chance mutations that then produce changes in organisms. And then the ones that have a biological sexual advantage, then those get selected by natural selection. And it's those combined processes that form what's originally called evolution. And evolution is the third major force, along with chance, mutations, and natural selection. And he pointed out that even all of those three, the way they're now understood today, could not possibly produce, for statistical and other reasons, cannot possibly produce the degree of evolution that we see occurring in this universe. He said you need a fourth force, and he called it, and I love this, evolutionary love, because that would be the force that would keep moving, driving towards higher and higher types of form. So there's a fairly well-known researcher in abiogenesis, which is the study of the actual origin of life on this planet. And word has it that he's as close to cracking this as anybody. But for his explanatory scheme, the scheme he's using, and the scheme that's claimed to be as close as any are, the very first thing that he has in his scheme, without which the entire sequence won't even get going, is what he calls an increased probability machine. And that means there has to be built in to the whole evolutionary sequence an anti-probability machine. So that means that's a force that pushes evolution into higher and higher states. And it's operating against the second law of thermodynamics. But without that, just to get it started, he can't, his whole system doesn't work. So those are some typical points where evolutionary biology itself is undergoing a dramatic shift. And it's not decided, but the momentum is moving away from standard evolution, which almost everybody agrees cannot explain the winding up of the universe. Because when you look just at evolutionary sequences, the world, the universe is not winding down, it's winding up. I mean, it's gone from dirt to the sonnets of Shakespeare, or however else you want to think about it, or simply from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms, the higher, more complex multicellular organism, and so on up the tree of life. So that is a part that I see as being a major change in contemporary science. And in a sense, it's one of the most important, because standard sort of Darwinian evolution, because the what of evolution, nobody doubts that. So, but then there's the why of evolution, which almost everybody doubts. But even when you hear scientists talk today about evolution, they'll frequently say it can't be dismissed. It's absolutely true the way it is. And all of biology is built upon this foundation of evolution. But all they need is the what of evolution. But as to the why, don't get them started on that, because they don't have any good idea.
Tolerance for it either.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer. I mean, I think that, you know, I love the fact there's a lot of speculative philosophy in this area. You know, people saying, this is not the answer, but let's open our minds to all these different vectors or gradients or forces. And yeah, so that's really interesting. It's an exciting field, and it'll probably explain more than evolution, right? Once there's a breakthrough, there's probably all these ramifications.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Bonnitta. So next up, we have the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Gail Bradbrook, with us. I think she was just hanging out at Amazon, if I'm not not mistaken. Gail, you can ask Ken your question.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. It's really good to get a chance to connect. What Peter's referring to is that there are 15 Amazon depots that got blockaded by Extinction Rebellion people today as a gesture against the sort of force of Black Friday. So possibly not, if I'm honest, with the messaging that I would have used. There's something that's against a lot of the time in activist circles. I was really interested in what you're saying. It's quite late here in the UK, by the way, so my mind's not feeling at its sharpest. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about activist spaces. We're thinking about what next and how, and it felt like a lot of what you were just talking to with Bonnitta was a perfect segue to the question that I have that's rather vague, really. So I think I'm just saying, do you have any advice for me? I think a lot about the concept of the sort of domination paradigm of patriarchy, of the sort of wet eco, scarcity, separation and powerlessness mentality that we're in and that we recreate, including and sometimes especially in activist spaces. And we've been working on our self-organizing systems, and often they get set aside for the domination that wants to come through yet again. Right. And I guess I spend a lot of time being curious about how does one tackle domination without meeting it with more domination? Because it feels to me at least that the economic system, the paradigm that we're in beyond that is a self-optimizing system at the minute. It always seems to find a way round. So it's a success to success mechanism, and it's destroying the planet, right? I mean, it's clear to me that, at least, and it feels to me that there's something in meeting a domination paradigm. I don't even want to necessarily say resisting it as if it's always bad, but meeting it with something. You talked about evolutionary love that might feel like a self-organizing system that's got an what did you say, an anti-evolutionary machine in it, something like that. I feel that there's something in activism that could birth some of these things, you know. I'm not asking a very clear question at all, so I'm just welcoming you to take whatever you can from that disorganized thought process and share any thoughts you have.
Well, let me ask, when you say there's some movement that can destroy or attack these power structures. Could you clarify what the two sides of this battle are as you see them?
Well, that's what I say, and in a way I don't see it as a battle. I think it's often seen as a battle in activist spaces.
As a what? It's seen as a what?
A battle in activists.
A battle.
Yeah, but I guess I don't see it like that. I'm not saying my analysis is correct, so that's why I'm open to some other thought process. Right. But I guess what I think I see is the story of separation, where you built an entire system, including, you know, GDP growth and so on, right. Whereby if you're the one that pushes for success within this paradigm, you'll get more resources, and you can use that to get more resources. And right. Over the time, that's destroying democracy, it's destroying communities, and so on. And what Extinction Rebellion has done well so far is to name something, is to say, hello, we're in a crisis, folks. Right. And that's you know, something. But I think in terms of meeting a system of domination with battle, it doesn't feel like that's going to work. Yeah. And it feels to me that there is some way of getting organized in a way that just refuses to participate, but we need the collective body. But I'm not really sure, Ken. I'm just asking you. I have some influence on a social movement. Right. I'm interested in self-organizing. Are there any sort of thoughts you want to share in that space? Sure. Yeah.
Well, let's just lead off from where my previous discussion was going. And that is that, generically speaking, as sort of just two different approaches we can take to the environment. One is that it's running downhill to nearly extinction levels. And when we have that view, it's a somewhat negative outcome, and certainly extinction is about as negative as you can get. And so if you're thinking along that way, then you marshal any information that comes into you and you fit it into this negative downhill framework. Now, I'm not saying that that's all wrong. I'm just saying that there's a tendency, when you have a framework that says we're going extinct, then any types of information you take in will tend to be included in your picture if it helps along with this negative look. But if we just take, not as a total positive thing, but if we just saw evolution as actually driving towards an increase in organization and an increase in positive actions, then that's at least a balancing viewpoint to this, oh, it's all negative, versus, oh, wait, there's an intense positive drive driven in it. And we have to note that in terms of the past, say, 20, 25 years, when there's been an increasingly negative understanding of what's happening in terms of our environmental safety, that also the world has incredibly increased and gotten better in an extraordinary number of ways. So, for example, world poverty just 20 years ago was at about 50% of the world. Today, it's less than 10%. So there are some very good things happening in the world, along with these very bad possibilities. And all I would like to see is, in a sense, and I'll put this in a mechanical way, but every time a negative statement is made, a positive statement is made alongside it. And then we can depend we can try to discern, well, which of those is winning, the negative or the positive. But now in strong groups like Extinction Rebellion, I don't see that attempt at balancing the real forces that are going on. And I would just like to see more of that, because it really does. Most people think that, for example, if you look at extreme weather events, heat deaths due to global warming, hurricanes getting worse and causing more damage, and all of those, if you actually plot things like the date versus hurricane damage, or if you just plot the overall number of deaths from climate change, what we see over the past 50 years is a dramatic decrease in overall deaths from excessive weather. And I mean, it's down really from being several million a year to about 20,000 a year. So that is a piece of good news. I would just like those good news portions put alongside the negative extinction aspects. And I certainly think that if you do that, you can still look at the negatives that are occurring compared with the positives, and then try to make an overall judgment and say, yes, well, it was still the negatives outweighing the positive. But if you do that, you really have to use scientific data that we have now. We're undergoing a 6th major mass extinction, for example. There's absolutely no scientific evidence that that's happening. But if you just got a sort of a globalist extinction view, it's, of course, we're in the middle of a mass extinction. But the data just doesn't show that. And so I think we have to be very careful about how we call on data to support the views, because in many cases, the negative extinction level trends that are sometimes seen in the world just aren't matched by actual data about what is really happening. And so I think, however that is examined, that they're both sides are worth viewing, and then trying to bring both sides together. So if you hear just an Extinction Rebellion speech, it's almost nothing but here's one bad thing after another bad thing after another bad thing after another bad thing. And for each of those bad things, there's at least some data showing a good thing that's reversing some of these downward trends. And so I'm just arguing that let's put them both together, and not, once you divide up into this is my position versus that position, you're never going to get them together, because the positive people are always going to be pointing to positive stuff. Bjorn Lomborg, for example, does that, and he's got some very good data. And he points out how extreme weather events, hurricanes, tornadoes, and so on, are actually, the damage being produced by them is going down dramatically. And so you just want to hear that alongside of the simply blanket assertion that, yeah, it's all getting worse and we're all going to hell type of thing. So I think that's a typical example of humans with their typical dualistic and polarizing approach to problems to just divide up. And I would like to see that calm down, as it were.
Can I respond, Peter? Is that all
Sure.
right with you? Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. I mean, I started off by saying with some of the messaging from today's action was not how I would have gone with it. And I think that's what Jamie Wheel's talking to in Recapture the Rapture, is both the, you know, increase in negative things happening and the increase in positive things happening. I'm willing to have my opinion changed here, but my sense is, I mean, Lomberg, who you've just quoted, there are others in that field, are highly, highly discredited. That there's what I'm talking about with this domination paradigm, the promotion of people and data sets that are phony, frankly. I mean, I'll give you an example. William Nordhaus was given a Nobel Prize in economics. It's not even a real Nobel Prize, right? It's funded by some bank. And he said 4 degrees of warming is optimal for economically. And the data in that Steve Keen's taken to pieces is shocking. And at 4 degrees of warming, what many commentators, you know, heads of climate impact research organizations, professors and so on, say is that there'll be half the world will die. So it's quite hard to stay in the positive, but I think, and same with those quotes you just gave me about poverty, Jason Hickel debunks a lot of the poverty things, because they are, you know, there's something in those stories that are in support of the paradigm that we're in. It says, "Oh, look, it's all," and you know, I really do get the sort of grinding negativity and activism that's not helping us. I'm with you, and you know, I mean, there are people promoting the idea that there's a flat earth. I just simply don't have the time to analyze every data set, right, that might come my way. And I sort of have to look at it through a lens of who funded that data set. Why is that data set being promoted? Right. Yeah, but I think there's something in what you were saying in your previous question that I would probably come back to about this, the sort of the place where I see the positivity is the rapid healing in people, the approaches around co-liberation, around organizing together in decentralized ways. That feels like the ways in which we can say no to domination collectively, but I'm not really clear how that works, but I have a sense of it and it feels positive. I mean, I'm quite an optimistic person on many fronts. Thank you for your time. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Now we have Zach Stein, author of Education in a Time Between Worlds. Zach, if you had a question for Ken.
Hey, Ken. It's good to see you.
Hey, Zach.
There's a lot of things that I could ask. I'm actually going to speak a little bit directly to freedom, right? Because we've been talking about evolution, we've been talking about socio-political issues. This is complex. I was going to ask you about David Graeber's book, but I'm not going to do that. What I want to ask you about is this thing that happens frequently when I speak to you. We've spoken more than a few times. It happened the first time I spoke to you very clearly, which was a nonverbal transmission coming from you to me that was saying something like, we have to save the great traditions.
Yeah.
Something like that. It was something like, who cares about other stuff? We have to save the great traditions. That the meaning crisis is fundamentally the most important of the crises that are playing out, and that in the absence of the resources and the symbols and images provided by the great traditions and the state access and these things, that what's worth saving if we don't have that actual form of true freedom. And so that always stuck with me. And I'm wondering, am I onto something? And can one read, in a sense, your work as an attempt to save these traditions in a moment of incredible crisis?
Yeah, I think it's a very important goal to try to do that. And in part, it's because, and you really do have to look at the differences between, let's say, the path of growing up that human beings go through versus the path of waking up that they can undertake. And it turns out that you can have a waking up experience at many of the different stages of growing up. So we know that not everybody who has a waking up experience is at the very, very top of developmental stages. Because somebody at a rational stage or a pluralistic stage or an integral stage, or even earlier, somebody at traditional stage can have various types of waking up experiences. And you would agree with that in general. And the problem that we have in the West is that as we went from a mythic, ethnocentric, traditional stage of development, which was present through most of the Middle Ages, to a rational, world-centric Enlightenment stage of development. This was the first big battle between science and religion in the Western world. Because if you had trouble in the Middle Ages and you needed help, you went to a priest or a minister or a rabbi. That's where you would go if you wanted an ultimate truth to help you out of the horrible crisis that you were going through. Religion would be the main guide to do that. And religion at that stage was often at what Fowler called a mythic literal stage of development. So that means all of the myths and miracles in the Bible were taken to be literally true. So Christ really was born of a biological virgin. He really was the sole biological son of the creator of the entire universe. This is Zeus and Apollo and Aphrodite type beliefs. And in their lesser forms, Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and all of these sort of mythic miracles and magics and supernatural events that were occurring in the Bible. And those were exactly what, as the Western Enlightenment emerged, and it was a so-called age of reason. And so what did happen is in the overall movement that Gepsi called archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic and integral. This was the big stage between mythic and rational. And when rationality emerged and started to, as a leading edge in cultural evolution, started to dominate the advanced intellectual elite of the time, they tended to attack religion. But by religion, they basically meant the mythic literal forms of religion. And those are what was attacked. And there was even an attempt to separate the magic, mythic, supernatural, miracle forms of the Bible and take them out of the Bible and leave just more rational, moral approaches. I mean, there's even Thomas Jefferson. There's an apocryphal image of him sitting on the White House with a Bible in one hand and a pair of scissors in the other, and he's furiously cutting out all the magic and mythic aspects of the Bible just to leave its rational and moral aspects. This was actually published, so it was called the Jefferson Bible. So it's welcome to a rational view of religion. But when rationality threw out all of mythic literal reality, it didn't tend to distinguish between the growing up aspects of religion and the waking up aspects of religion. And so what happened is that not only did mythic rational religion get tossed out when God was pronounced dead, many of the mystical or the core of the traditions were also thrown out. So what we find with the modern era is that there's increasingly less emphasis given on everything from Eckhart to the cloud of unknowing to St. Dionysius and the Neoplatonic traditions. And so what started to happen with the modern era, in addition to its very positive scientific aspects, its elimination of slavery, there are many, many profound positive aspects that came from this being at a world-centric level of development. But they also tended to throw out the mystical forms of, well, religion, just because all religion was sort of looked upon as suspect. So part of the, although what we see in history is, just generally speaking, a broad evolutionary movement from, again, because I've mentioned them, I just use them as one without endorsing everything about it, but the movement from archaic to magic to mythic to rational, pluralistic to integral was itself an evolutionary movement. And it was always there as part of the inherent drive that was present in overall Western civilization. But as we got into the modern age of reason, both religion and spirituality, or mystical states, or these traditional forms that we're talking about, what I think need to be recovered or at least accessed, that became not something that tended to be inherited in our cultural unfolding of the types of knowledge that it was important to have. So, and that went along with dropping out astrology in favor of astronomy and alchemy in favor of chemistry, and those similar types of rationalizations and demythologizing of the world that went on at that broad span. And so by the time modernity and the Enlightenment had finished its impact on culture, the official background philosophy of the modern West was scientific materialism. And that's the major bedrock of what we, in almost all of our attempts at knowledge, we look to scientific materialism as the ground, as the fundamental floor. But what that doesn't include are all of the mystical, traditional, core aspects of religion. And so I see that, because usually evolution is a transcend and include, transcend and include. So it tends to include a lot of the important elements at the stage that it's transcending or that it's moving beyond, because it transcends and includes. But spirituality or traditional mystical core fundamental aspects of spirituality tended not to be included. So that is a real problem for me. And as I started writing, one of the major impacts on me was, before I wrote my first book, I just stumbled on to Zen Buddhism. And I read D.T. Suzuki's Essays in Zen Buddhism, which is a 3-volume book. And he just started out talking about there were at least 2 forms of knowing. There was typical everyday rationality, but then there was something called Satori. And in this Satori, you had a realization of your fundamental oneness with everything. So you no longer felt that you were just what Alan Watts used to call an ego, skin encapsulated ego. You weren't just that, you were literally one with the entire universe. And when you had a Satori, that's what you felt. You felt this oneness of everything. And that, well, as Jordan Peterson put it, that changes our notions of reality. And it does, because usually when a person has an experience and it seems sort of a little weird or out of the ordinary, and they stay as their individual self, they'll think, oh, that's wrong. That's a stupid, I had an hallucination or something went wrong, and that's not what's real. But with mystical experience, it's the other way around. You say, oh, that oneness, that's what's real. Our ordinary lives, that's what's not real. And so that was the part that, as I began my own writing career, I always wanted to include that aspect of reality, simply because, as like Houston Smith or any of the other scholars in this area would point out, that's the one universally recognized real reality. And so I wanted to make sure that that was the basis of anything I was doing. And I just kept that notion that, yeah, whatever we do and all the important other types of areas that we study, and I study several of them, including what I call showing up, opening up, growing up, cleaning up. All of these areas are included on their own, but they're always related to, and you can have this background of an absolute oneness with the entire universe. And you will think, when you have this experience, it's the most real, most absolute, most undeniable experience you have ever had. And that was Satori. And incidentally, my main reaction when I finished reading this 3 volumes of Zen Buddhism, for about 4 days afterwards, my main response was I was enraged. I was simply in a state of absolute anger, because I was thinking to myself, why didn't anybody tell me about this earlier? I mean, I've had to live through 18 years of life not knowing that there's an ultimate reality, an absolute consciousness, and state of ultimate unity consciousness that I can have, and that will essentially, if not answer all the questions, because it won't answer all the relative questions that you have, but the most fundamental questions: who am I? What does this mean? Why am I here? Those are all satisfactorily answered. So that was the sort of long background story of how I discovered these traditions, and then why I felt it was necessary to include them in any work that I did. So
yeah, thank you, Ken. I mean, that, that's my sense. It's very interesting to hear you speak to it directly, and to hear the story about reading the Zen essays. It's beautiful. And it ties into a sense I've always had of your work, that it's not naive growth to goodness, even though there is growth and there is goodness. The subtitle of the book, Eye of Spirit, was, for a world gone slightly mad. And you just made the point here that there was, with the emergence of modernity, a disruption of intergenerational transmission around precisely the most important topics we get into. And so I'm wondering, Ken, thinking of the future, is it a religion of no religion, or is it a resuscitation of the traditions, or is it both, or some combination?
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be some combination of both. One of the ways that I have tended to differentiate this, and I'll modify it in a minute, but if you talk about, it's very common to talk about these enlightened figures as if they're mostly from the past. And one of the reasons there's that truth is that with the Western Enlightenment and all of that religious stuff, all that mystical stuff got pushed out, then it made it a bit harder for enlightened individuals to show up in the modern and postmodern world. So I would always be faced with, well, take Buddha some 2,000 years ago. He was generally acknowledged to be an enlightened being. But then if we have evolution continuing on, wouldn't some people evolve into a possibility of a more enlightened state? So even though Buddha had realized pure emptiness, there was still a world of form that was evolving. And so the question was, take Buddha's enlightenment of 2,000 years ago, and then take a spiritual teacher's enlightenment today, say they have a very deep enlightenment, and they're including more of the world of form that they're one with, because form has continued to evolve. So I would say, in terms of nirvana, emptiness realization, that's the same in both people. But the teacher that lived 2,000 years later than Buddha had continued to evolve beyond where Buddha was. But the core of the enlightenment, the pure emptiness at the core of it, were the same in both people. But the evolutionary form of the later teacher was more complete, because it was one with more of the manifest realm. And the manifest realm had definitely continued to evolve. So I sort of liked that solution, because on the one hand, yes, Buddha was as enlightened as anybody could be, but he didn't have a full, his enlightenment wasn't as full as more recent teachers were, because they had access to the same core emptiness that Buddha had, and that it had awakened him. But they also had access to more form in the manifest realm. And when they became one with all of that, their enlightenment, so to speak, was bigger. It covered more ingredients. And I still think that's essentially true. But I think that when we see this tradition, if it is picked up and becomes part of our future evolutionary capacities, that it will be a mixture of those, because clearly an emptiness that's one with all form in 500 AD China is not as complete as an emptiness that's one with all of postmodernity, with all of its computers and internet access. The world of form has just gotten more and more complex over the years. So the unity of emptiness and form has likewise gotten more complex, even though the waking up to pure emptiness is the core of enlightenment. So Buddha can be just as enlightened as subsequent teachers, but it's not as complete. And I believe that's pretty much unavoidable. And I think that what will happen as this awareness is incorporated in culture, and if it does go forward, it'll be a mixture of those two, a mixture of a pure emptiness with an increasingly, massively increasing complexity of form. And that is ultimately what enlightenment is the unity of emptiness and form. As, of course, the Heart Sutra puts it, that which is emptiness is not other than form. That which is form is not other than emptiness. So there will be a deep non-dual unity between emptiness and form. But that form is going to increasingly get more and more complex and more changing. Whereas emptiness itself doesn't have any parts. So it doesn't have anything to evolve. It's what Dan Brown calls changeless, boundless awareness. And it doesn't change. It's the same emptiness that you realize now is the same emptiness that Buddha realized. It's boundless, changeless. But we do have a world that continued to evolve. And so putting emptiness, which doesn't evolve, together with form, which does evolve, will give us the typical state that I think will go on with. The important part is the enlightenment aspect of it, because that's what you want. When you realize the emptiness part, you're realizing the ground of all being. And so that is what gives a profound meaning to these Satori type, enlightenment type, awakening type experiences. So I think that's the way we'll see that go forward.
Thank you, Ken.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. So we have 2 more questions. Next one is from Greg Thomas from the Jazz Leadership Project. Greg, your question.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Ken, good to see you.
Good to see you.
This is a follow-up to a question concerning race that I actually asked you in 2010.
Okay.
During, the Integral Spirituality, a Deeper Cut conversations. And in your response to my question, you gave a natural history of the function of race and related notions from the indigenous through the traditional, modern, and postmodern stages, ending at integral, where you said, quote, "It's something we have to transcend. We grow up and grow out of it in our developmental stages. Integral levels continue to define race as useless as a concept. It really doesn't say anything real or truthful or useful about a human being."
Object on road ahead.
So in retrospect, Ken, I realized that your statement was similar to what the great writer on American and Black American culture, Albert Murray, wrote 40 years earlier in his classic, The Omni-Americans. He wrote that, quote, "Race is hardly as useful as an index to human motives as is culture."
Right.
So Ken, why is culture a better index for human motives?
Well, in part, I don't want to, although I will try to answer your question, but I want to point out that I don't want to select one quadrant in when we talk about culture, that's the lower left quadrant, versus individual interiors, which is the upper left quadrant, and then the exteriors of both of those. So the exterior of an individual mind is the physiological brain. That's the interior and the exterior view of reality. So mind and brain go together, but they're not the same thing. Your mind, well, your brain looks like a crumpled grapefruit. You can see it. It's a third person object. But your mind doesn't look like a crumpled grapefruit at all. It has all sorts of images and symbols and visions and thoughts and so on. So when we talk about whether something like race is an important concept, and then if that's so, why could culture be more important? And I would rather talk about the interaction of both of them. So if you focus just on culture or on group selection, you tend to get caught up in identity politics. And that's not a necessarily great way to think of things. I think there is some truth to identity politics, but you have to be careful about it, because if you deliberately select one categorization of your identity politics, it's always an ethnocentric selection. I mean, if you're choosing to identify with being Black or white or female or Hispanic or any of those are all by definition ethnocentric choices, because you're just identifying with one out of many cultures or ethnic.
But Ken, I'm not specifically talking about either a quadrant absolutism in terms of culture as intersubjective agreements, and I'm definitely not talking about a postmodern conception of culture that's focused on identity per se.
Got it.
I'm focusing, even if we focused on culture as the lower left quadrant, that is about how human beings have their intersubjective agreements in order to enact working together, creating art, et cetera, values and meaning. It doesn't mean that the lower right quadrant, which structures and institutions and such, but I'm saying, since race we know, as expressed in terms of racialization and racism such, really derives from ethnocentrism and even xenophobia, if you go back far enough, obviously. But I'm talking about a conception of culture. Since culture is one of your 4 quadrants, that is an actual index of human actuality and reality, whereas race is not only false biologically, in terms of, I mean, we know that, that race, that it just doesn't have meaning, but you do have meaning in culture, in and through culture. I'm not saying you don't have the upper right with the brain and the nervous system. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if we look at what my friend Stanley Crouch called the decoy of race, versus the actuality of culture, wouldn't that be a better way of looking at our human reality and human potential?
Yeah, I think definitely under those circumstances, because what you find with culture, and you find this in all shapes of cultures. So I'm not saying you have to choose one or the other. I'm just talking about what culture does. Culture is the entire background that teaches individuals how to be individuals. So you might think every time you're thinking an individual mind thought, and you're having that thought, like maybe it might be, it's time to watch my favorite podcast. So you're having that thought, but that thought depends on an immense amount of language and structural language. And you have to learn that language basically before you can really think in obvious ways. And there's also, your culture teaches you ways of behavior that are acceptable, ways of work that are acceptable, even types of food that you're going to find acceptable. So it's really a great fertile breeding ground of individuals that come up. And then what can happen is, due to stages of development, those individual cultural items can expand. So you can go from just identifying with yourself to identifying with a group. And then that group can identify with a world-centered or all human beings. And as you get into integral stages, they tend to integrate and embrace all of those. So if you're just looking at it from an integral stage, which doesn't exist by its own, it's always enveloping these lower stages. But if you just say, okay, what's happening at integral, then you can say, okay, race isn't important at that point, whether you're white or Asian or green or black. That's not what integral is focusing on. Integral is, by its very nature, looking at what do all of those have in common. And that is a level that you can act from, as what is it that is human in a universal way. Now, if you believe in strict identity politics, you don't believe in universal anything, except you believe that your own idea is universally true. So there's a little problem with that. But the idea is that as you keep growing through higher and higher stages, you're transcending and including those stages. And so you go from stages where are just egocentric, just your own self, and it's being attempting to be socialized by its culture and so on. And when the individual human organism, which starts out pretty blank-headed, when it gets up to age 2 or 3, it starts moving into ethnocentric cultures, which just mean, not in a bad sense, but just meaning that you're identified with a whole group of people instead of just yourself. And so you can start caring for people and embracing them and learning to love and be loved. And it's also where you learn most of your language and all of these things that plug you in to a particular identity group. But then as you move up from that, then you tend to start to transcend being identified with just that group, because you notice there are lots of other groups in the world. And maybe I want to expand my identity to include all humans. And so if you look at Carol Gilligan, if you look at her name for these 3 stages of egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric, she calls egocentric the selfish stage. She calls ethnocentric the care stage, because when you move up from just thinking about yourself to thinking about others in the group, you can start indeed to care for them, to have real compassion and real empathy. And then the highest stage, the world-centric stage, she calls not care, but universal care. So that's where you're starting to expand your identity to include all humans. And when you do that, all humans are thought to be, that they should be treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And that's where that notion comes from. So as you move out of your special group, your limited identity group, which is still very important for your own growth And learning, as I said, it's where you learn language, you learn behavior, even eating skills and so on. But there are higher states of identity, and that includes universal care. So at that point, you start thinking about universal values. And that is particularly where somebody like Martin Luther King would be speaking from. And that's in almost all forms of history, that's held to be a very high stage of human development, simply because it does include all human beings and wants to treat them all fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, creed. And then you can go beyond that into integral stages, which look at all of the previous stages and attempt to draw them all together and understand the importance that each of them is bringing to an overall full human being. And so that's where, as I say, at the integral stage, you can say, well, race isn't important, oh, groups aren't important, and I said, but that's not what the person at an integral stage is actually doing. What they're actually doing is attempting to look at all different groups and give them the dignity and the partial reality that they deserve. Because each of those great realms of development have a partial truths, and those very much need to be included. So, example, when you learn language, that's a partial truth that you need to include. When you learn particular modes of behavior, or dance, or song, or any of those are all true, but partial, because partial, they can be included by higher forms of that. And so what I would like to see in terms of how race relations and race development continues is that all four of these stages of what it means to be Black are included. So you never lose the important components of the lower level. So even a person that's at ethnocentric care stage still has their own little egocentric stage tucked in, and they're still going to watch out for that. But they can also reach out and embrace a whole group, a whole community. And that, if you're Black, that community might be largely Black, but you never lose that Blackness as part of your own fundamental identity. And then when you get to universal care, then you'd be looking for universal identity. And that can include my Blackness plus fitting in with cultures that are white, and what do they have to tell me, or what can I learn from that stage? Because I'm still a Black man, but I'm moving through these higher and wider states of awareness. So.
Thank you so much, Ken. I know John Vervaeke wants to get in here, so I just say that one of the ways that I would sum up what you're saying is an idea from philosopher Anthony Appiah, rooted cosmopolitanism.
Yes, yeah, that's great. I love that.
All right, okay.
Thanks, Greg. So yeah, let's go to the last question. The man who's trying to awaken us from the meaning crisis, John Vervaeke.
I love John.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Ken. So it sounds like you're a bit familiar with my work. I'm doing a lot on awakening from the meaning crisis, and the evidence for the meaning crisis, I think, is quite significant. And one of the, two areas that to me are coming to the foreground right now are the issues around embodiment, embodied cognition, embodied embedded, and of course, emerging ecologies of practices, new practices and ecologies of practices that are emerging And they're often very interesting. There's a lot, of course, going on around authentic dialogue practices. I've got my friend and colleague Rafe Kelly integrating parkour and narrative. There's a lot of experimentation going on. Nora Bateson does her warm data lab. Anyways, that's just a preamble to the question, which is, in the religion that's not a religion, or perhaps you would call it the religion of tomorrow. What do you see as what are the emerging practices, and especially in the context of the new cyber technologies, like what we're doing right now? What do you see as the emerging practices that are responding either reactively or responsibly to the meaning crisis?
Yeah, I think that there are various ways to look at the historical origin of the so-called meaning crisis. And in part, I see it as in evolutionary and developmental psychology terms, if you want. And although when we discuss developmental psychology, we have to have an enormous number of little footnotes and explanations about what we mean and all of that. But if I can simplify it just horribly by referring to Gene Gebser's main stages of development, which he called archaic to magic to mythic to rational or mental rational, and then pluralistic and then integral. What we see if we trace meaning structures at each of those stages of development, that we get very powerful meaning systems, which I'm thinking about. I just watched a podcast with you and Jordan Peterson and Barron
and Pajot, Jonathan Pajot, yeah.
Sharku. And so I'm thinking, all of that's running through my mind when I'm thinking about this as well. But you had, particularly in the mythic and what John Fowler calls the mythic literal stage of spiritual development, where the myths that you propose and cognition has only reached a certain mythic level. It's gone up from a magic sort of egocentric level to a mythic ethnocentric level. And so it's starting to talk about reality from that position. And what it does is it takes its mythic pronouncements, such as Christ is born from a biological virgin, he was dead and resurrected in 3 days, he physically ascended into heaven, he's the son of the one and only, he's the biological son of the one and only Father, who's the creator of the one and only universe. We would recognize all of those as being mythic statements. So at the mythic literal stage of development, you take all of those statements as being literally true. And so if you're at that level and you're a fundamentalist and you're reading the Bible, you'll take the Bible as being the literal word of God. It can't be criticized or challenged, because if you do, you're a heretic or a blasphemer or something like that. But those types of, y'all's discussion of meaning particularly involve a type of connection or an outreach or a touching with various things thought to be real. And what this mythic period produced was a very, very strong sense of meaning. Because in one angle, you can look at meaning as a profound connection with something, even a unity with it. But so even in simple linguistics, if you say, oh, here's the tree, what's the meaning of the word tree? well, you point to a real tree, and that's the connecting link is sort of empirically obvious. But then there are other types of meanings that don't point to just exterior physical objects, because many of the things that we look at aren't just third person realities, they're first person realities. And so we have and can create meaning around a whole series of words: love, care, compassion, understanding, mutual understanding, agreement. And all of those aren't words that just point to some external object. They often point to other words, which point to other words, and all in this internal nexus of interwoven interconnection. When that included a very strong feeling that God was real and you were connected in ultimate meaning with God, that's a very powerful meaning system. And that powerful meaning system basically lasted throughout the Middle Ages in Europe. And most people were indeed at least believers in the dogmatic mythic assertions of Christianity. And that became, everybody says that's part of the roots of our Western culture, the Judeo-mythic membership ideas that we largely took literally. And when science started emerging, the rational level in Gebser's scheme, and what is generally referred to as the age of reason, Will Durant called it the age of reason and revolution. And the revolution part was due to the inherent tension between a third person world-centric rationality and a second person ethnocentric group dominated belief system. And when science emerged with that third person capacity to see all people as world-centric and to be treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed, then that universal reality, I guess, started to form its own type of fairly strong meaning systems. Mm-hmm. And of course, there were a lot of things that were fighting with that meaning systems. And there were a lot of very detailed subdivisions given of it and so on. But basically, the age of reason was the age that meaning shifted to scientific meaning. And there is a problem with scientific meaning, and that is that it developed almost entirely as a way to explore third-person realities. Whitehead points out that modern science was invented independently and separately in 1605 by Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler. They both suggested that, quote, the laws of nature are to be best be understood through measurement. And that's what they started to do. I mean, Aristotle and many previous scientific thinkers had looked at nature in a strongly empirical way, had classified it, and given very powerful empirical approaches to nature. One thing they didn't do was consistently, on a large scale, measure. And it was that measurement that brought scientific reality into being. So Kepler measured the motions of planets and came up with his laws of planetary motion. Galileo measured the motions of terrestrial motion and came up with the laws of terrestrial motion. And then the super genius, Isaac Newton, put them all together and showed that the force that was, and this is commonly depicted as when an apple fell on his head, is what he realized was the same force that made the atom fall on his head was the same force that made the earth go around the sun, namely a universal gravity. So given that general background approach, that developed a core of meaning, where the meaning of a word or proposition you made was connected with the types of measurement that you could do in the external world to prove that your meaning was real. Now, there are a lot of, as I say, additional forces working here, such as what you all call the bottom down or top down and bottom up in terms of how to interpret all of this. And those were carried on mostly by the Neoplatonic tradition. But that was the tradition that essentially lost to the scientific materialism of the modern world. So we don't, there, some ways they're coming back as the inherent difficulties with just third-person reductionistic materialistic science tries to answer all questions, but can't even really account for its own existence. So, but nonetheless, there was a modern meaning structure that was created. But what happened as that kept going forward is that the big meaning structure that existed for most of the West through most of its history was the Judeo-Christian mythic meaning system. And as science continued to grow and as more and more people started adopting the scientific approach, and as we know, increase or belonging to world religions is one of the things that's dropped dramatically in the Western world. And so that is generally considered to be a real loss of meaning for the modern person, because science, it just doesn't address meaning very well, and not in the same way that a mythic God and Son of God and you're going to be saved and resurrected when you're dead and live forever in the right hand of God. Those are powerful meaning systems. And to whatever degree they were theologically and intensely adopted, most human beings simply growing up in that culture sort of accepted that meaning structure, and it gave them a great deal of meaning. Their relationship to Christ was a big bulwark in that meaning. And so as your cognitive capacities are reaching out for something to embrace and give a meaning to the person, those increasingly, as science continued to expand, and in terms of the outward belief systems, they were really sort of the opposite of each other. And if one went up, one went down. And as science kept going up, religion kept going down. And so what we find in today's world is that, again, more of the largest percentage of the younger generations in America now list none, N-O-N-E, as their religious background. And science is attempting to step into the place of creating a really valuable meaning structure. And it can't do that very well because of its historic embrace of third person, collective, systemic, material realities. And so that's why you get the new atheists arguing that all of those forms of previous meaning don't mean anything. We just have to start from scratch with rationality, which they simply assume whoever is born with rationality happens to be, they just lucked out, but they got it right. And everybody else who doesn't believe that are just congenital idiots. And that's sort of the argument you get with the new atheists. And they just happen to be among the group that lucked in to getting rationality. And we could talk a lot about the problems with that, but that's essentially what is going on. And then there's a lot of other topics that we could go into, like as science attempts to, in a sense, reconnect with all of reality, then it does come down to finding things like embodiment is necessary to really perform any sort of cognitive activity. And so this embodied embeddedness cognition becomes a very important part of what we're doing. And what we're doing, I think, to get a really meaningful situation would have to go with your post-nominal Neoplatonism. Because if you get the Neoplatonism, you're at least getting top down with bottom up. And that's going to be really crucial. So I think if science can really inhabit that type of understanding of meaning, then that would be a very, very good way to get out of the meaning crisis that science introduced with just its reductionistic attack on religion. And as science just grew in its reductionism and scientific materialism, religion continued sinking. And it's almost completely wiped out in Europe. I saw a latest poll that showed that less than 15% of people in Europe are actually mythic Christians. And so, there goes all that meaning. And so I would hope that modern science, as it goes forward, will increasingly examine ways to make it a post-nominal Neoplatonism. And that would sort of satisfy my talk with Zach when I explained that this tradition that included these types of mystical understandings would indeed be an important part of what I would like to see carried on, just because they carry so significant meaning structures and so much value that could be added. So that's why I've always appreciated your work, and I think that this would be a very good thing indeed.
Thank you for that. I'm honored that you appreciate my work, and your historical argument is quite convergent with one I've made, and I agree with the proposal that you've that I've made, that you're echoing about a post-nominalist Neoplatonism. I think Arthur Vos Lewis is right about Neoplatonism sort of being the spiritual grammar of the West in an important way. I guess to lead back to the question then, one of the things that I'm interested in is the degree to which this emerging form of Neoplatonism can help to coalesce and coordinate a lot of these emerging practices. So one of the things I'm engaging in is whether or not we can take a lesson, and I'm not nostalgic, I'm not trying to get back to the past, but can we take a lesson from the past about Neoplatonic practices of dialectic and dialogos and use those to help structure a lot of these emerging communities of discourse, like here at the Stoa.
Right.
And so that's a project I'm exploring right now. I get involved with these various groups, and also try to bring some cognitive science to bear on it. Do you see that as a fruitful way forward?
Yeah, I do. I'm a little concerned with how we'll make that translation. For example, you were talking about how science looks at causal events. You were giving an example of some item that was, I think it was a piece of rolling dirt.
Yeah.
And so you could look at it, you say, okay, why is that rolling? And everybody would say, well, pressure was put here, and this guy could do. But and that was sort of the bottom up part. But the top down part were all of the environmental surroundings
constraints
on the table, and it's moving through a certain medium, and all of those that are actually things that do encircle and control and are very much a causative part of why this rolls across the table.
Right.
And when I was hearing that, I thought that's a great idea. But then I was thinking, how would that actually be translated into a Neoplatonic upward and downward?
So one of the ideas is to see if we can, and this follows from a suggestion from Whitehead, if we can see the constraints as real structures of real possibility, and therefore they lay out the possibilities of intelligibility, and then via that you could start to connect it to a Neoplatonic framework. I think. I mean, I'm not saying this is a complete project, but my sense is that my intuition is that this is a viable project to pursue right now, and that's something I'm trying to do, with the help of a lot of other people, by the way.
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly very promising, and it looks very right. And I've always had a top-down, bottom-up explanation of how something like the great chain of being comes into existence. And there is an emanation that goes, the Christian version, the great chain goes matter to body, to mind, to soul, to spirit. And the way this gets started is spirit throws itself outward just for the sport and play of it, just the spontaneousness of it. And it creates a step down version of itself called the soul. And the soul steps out of itself and creates a step down version of itself called mind. And then mind creates body, and then body finally blows into matter, and that's the Big Bang. And it just has matter. There are no living cells, no living body, no mind, no soul. But it has this inherent drive to return.
The procession and the return, very much.
Right, which is showing up in evolutionary biology as arguments in favor of things like self-organization.
Very much.
So,
are you familiar with Erigena? Because for me, he represents the sort of fruition of this line of development of getting the bottom up and the emanation and the emergence to be completely interpenetrating, which of course is why he was found to be a heretic. Because I want to talk to you more, Ken, and I think that would be great. Unfortunately, I do have to go, and I feel like an opportunity is being lost here. But if at some time you and I could talk more at length, I would greatly enjoy that.
That would be fun. Okay, we'll put it on our calendar.
Okay, thank you, Peter, very much. Always good to see you, my brother.
Yes, likewise, my friend. Take care. A dream come true seeing John Vervaeke and Ken Wilber dialogue at the Stoa for me. So we'll gently close out here, and I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Ken, do you have any parting words for us before we formally close today?
Well, I guess I would say that it looks to me like one of the major drives in today's world is after we have gone through incredible specialization and division of knowledge and the separation of fields of knowledge into increasingly separate and isolated accounts, which I think all of them are very important and have added enormously to our increasing knowledge of virtually all these areas. But there also has to be, not just in the narrow fields of knowledge, but just as we look at the world ourselves, the extreme polarization that we're facing in this country, the extreme retribalization, that's just another example of the retribalization in knowledge. And so my one common theme in every book I've written, in all 30 books, has been there has to be an integral drive hidden in there somewhere. And that evolution is a process of transcending and including, transcending and including. So atoms emerged, then molecules transcended atoms, but they also included them in their structure. And then as evolution went forward, molecules came together into cells. So cells transcended molecules, but then cells included molecules within their very being. And then molecules and cells went into multicellular animals, but they transcended and included all cells in their makeup. So there is a drive towards an integral capacity in our world. And that's what I would simply like us to keep in mind. And that's why I appreciated John's discussion of getting science together as a post-nominalist Neoplatonism, because Neoplatonism has, like virtually all of the great traditional philosophies, a drive upward that's inclusive, as well as a drive downward. And both of those are present. I call the drive down in all of my works involution, and then the return is called evolution. And they both happen, and they're both extremely important. And what we want now is we're going through a period where I think it's precisely because of what Gebser called the pluralistic or relativistic stage, that we're going through a tendency to separate and divide. And that would be fine if we kept in mind the inherent drive to integration that goes along with all of those separations. But by and large, we haven't. And we're not doing it in society. We're not doing it in education. We're not doing it in our knowledge communities. And that's a real problem. So as an integral theorist, I would just like to close out with that, a little push for keeping in mind any integral impulse that comes your way, whether it's integrating science and Neoplatonism. I mean, just those are perfect examples of what I think are important. So I would just like to leave people with the thought of anytime you find something that you can pull together, get on board with that.
Beautiful. I think the Stoa itself could be used one big integral impulse. And it's so good having you finally here, Ken, a place where the spirit of integral theory is alive and well. And we'd love to have you come back and dialogue with John, Bonnitta, and everyone here at the Stoa.
Thank you.
So to make some quick closing announcements for some upcoming events, the Authentic Relating Movement, Susan Campbell, the grandmother of Authentic Relating, joining with Sarah Ness and Jason Diggs, two players in the Authentic Relating scene. You're going to have a conversation at the Stoa on December 15th at 1 p.m. You can RSVP at the Stoa. We got this interesting event called Steamology, Steaming Towards Authentic Connections. And Alexi, if you can plug that one for us.
We are at Steamology. We are experimenting and investigating ancient indigenous traditions of steam healing and finding a place for that in the modern world, because that could help us to embody very deep states of human encounter. And actually through that, we can heal communities. And we will talk about that on December 17th. Very appreciated for today's talks. Thank you, Peter.
Beautiful. And think of like Russian Banya and authentic relating, and that's what that session is going to be about. So it's going to be quite delicious. So that being said, Ken, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Yes, thank you.